Welcome to part 3 of the Dog Gym Training Foundation course. We're now going to look into rewards and how and when to use them. Let's remind ourselves that dogs learn through trial and error, or associating an action with an outcome. If the outcome is positive, then the action will likely be repeated. A negative outcome will result in the action being avoided. So it seems sensible, therefore, that if we want our dogs to perform an action, we need to make the experience of that action a positive one. If we don't want our dogs to perform an action such as knock over the rubbish bin, then making this a negative experience will likely make the dog think twice before performing it again. The trouble here is that the outcome to the dog can be both positive and negative. After knocking over the bin, the handler shouted and caused fear, i.e. a negative outcome, but if the dog was able to eat some of the food out of the bin, a positive outcome also occurred. If the positive outcome was beneficial to the dog, in particular if it met the basic needs of the dog, such as food or water in this case, then it's likely that the positive outcome will outweigh the negative one and the action will be repeated again. Knowing this is important. If our dog has experienced a positive outcome from eating out of the bin and it's likely to do it again, then that handler has two options. Make it a negative outcome if it happens again, but this relies on the handler catching the dog in the act, or prevent it from happening again by restricting access to the bin. Making it a negative outcome is tricky, and the handler risks reducing the bond between themselves and their dog. If dogs learn by this association between positive and negative outcomes, then the more the handler acts in a negative way to the dog, the less time the dog is going to want to spend with the handler, and the more fearful the dog will be in the handler's presence. Let's remind ourselves that a dog in stages of fear or anxiety is going to have a diminished learning capability. So, what and how do we reward our dogs? Well, let's remember the basic needs: food and water, shelter and security, play and reproduction. Keeping the handler happy will mean the dog is continued to be supplied with these needs, so praising your dog is important, as this increases their feeling of security. It's also the easiest reward to provide and can be given instantly. Food and play are just as easy to provide if we plan our training sessions in advance and prepare tasty treats and dig out some favourite toys. With most creatures on the planet, including humans, it has to be worthwhile performing actions for us to continue repeating them. Many of us are unlikely to go to work for very little or no payment. We're even less likely to go to work if the job is complicated and the pay is not high enough. There aren't many of us who would want to run an international business for minimum wage, for example. The same can be said for dogs. Ask your dog to sit repeatedly for no praise or reward, and it's unlikely to continue repeating this action. Be sure to reward every time when training initially. Once the dog is trained, and we'll talk about that more later, rewards can be phased out because of the anticipation of a reward serves to keep the dog focused. Rewards should still be given randomly to avoid the dog becoming frustrated and disillusioned with the task and giving it up. If the task we ask our dog to perform includes a negative aspect, for example, asking the dog to stay in one place for a length of time while the handler goes out of sight of the dog, then we need to make sure that the positive outcome for achieving the task outweighs the negative aspect associated with the handler being out of sight. If the reward we offer is great, then it becomes worthwhile to the dog to stay until the handler returns. In addition, if the dog's already doing something or distracted and we ask it to perform an action, so for example asking the dog to return to you while it's meeting a basic need like eating or playing with other dogs, then it's already performing a task and self-rewarding with a basic need. In this situation, it's important that the dog realises that by performing the requested action to recall to the handler, it will receive a positive outcome that's more beneficial to it than the food on the floor it's already eating or the dog it's already playing with. So to summarise this basic training principle, if the task is tough, then the reward has to be high. If the task contains negative aspects, then the reward needs to be high. If the dog is distracted with fulfilling a basic need, then the reward needs to be high. Let's look then at what makes a high reward. I like to think of reward as a scale. At the low end would be perhaps a pat on the head with a good dog. At the other end would be a handful of cooked meats, loads of praise, and playtime with perhaps a favourite toy. Thinking of reward as a scale like this helps us to pick the right reward for the complexity of the task. Picking more than one reward on the scale and combining them increases the value even further. So for example, sustained praise with a handful of training treats followed by play with a favourite toy, it should have the dog begging for more of the same task. A dog who's asked to stay in one position for 10 minutes will have no problem doing this if it knows it's going to get a combination of rewards in this way. The final thing to say on rewards is that every time you ask your dog to perform a task, successful completion of the task should immediately be marked with praise. Repeating the command in this praise by saying, for example, good sit, increases the association of the command sit to the task, thereby speeding up the learning process. Some trainers advocate using a clicker to mark tasks. However, in my opinion, a clicker is not necessary if the handler is quick to mark the command with praise. Using a clicker can remove the emotion from the praise, and it fails to show the dog their handler is pleased. If the time between the dog completing the task and marking the task is too long, then learning might not take place, as the dog won't associate, for example, sitting with the praise of good sit. So a handler should look to marking completed tasks within 2 to 3 seconds of the dog achieving it in order to get the best results out of this training method. It's important when you're asking your dog to do something to not keep repeating the command. Keep saying sit, 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 sit to your dog, and all that's going to do is confuse them. They're going to look out, if they do learn it that way, they're potentially going to learn that sit, the command for sit, to get me to sit, you have to go sit, 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 5 or 6 times before they actually do sit. So when you're asking the dog to do something, use the body language, maintain the body language if necessary to get the dog to do it, but wait, have patience, say sit, and then wait. When they sit, get in there with a mark of that behaviour. Good sit, well done, and loads of fuss and the reward. So let's summarise the session on rewards. First of all, dogs learn by association. If an action produces a positive outcome, it will likely be repeated by the dog. Rewarding a dog with its basic needs will increase the value of the reward. Be sure to choose a reward equal to the complexity of the task. A bigger reward can outweigh negative aspects, such as, for example, being out of sight for the dog during a stay. Think of rewards as being on a scale. Combining rewards from the scale can increase the overall value of the reward. Remember, the scale can be different for each dog, and it's the handler's job to work out the level of value that you attach to each point on the scale. Be sure to mark the command word, for example when you're doing a sit, good sit, or down, good down, within 2 to 3 seconds of the dog performing it. The last thing I want to say about rewards, in particular treat rewards, is that if you're worried about your dog putting on weight during this training and reward-based training like this, then cut back on their food, give them less at breakfast, tea time, that kind of thing, or use the actual mealtime foods as the reward when you're training. Thank you for listening. Next up is part 4, setting up training.